Hello and welcome. My name is Amanda Graham. I am the academic director at the Irving Institute for Energy and Society at Dartmouth College. And I'm delighted, to welcome you this morning or this afternoon to the current instantiation of our new energy series. The new energy series is a platform for young and emerging scholars in energy all across the energy landscape. Methodologically and from disciplinary perspectives and technology and policy and culture, really a platform for young scholars to share their work and for the rest of us to learn about their work. And it's really been a fun series for us to host, and because we are learning so much about up-and-comers, emerging scholars in this space, and the exciting work that they are all doing. So in that vein, I'm really delighted today to welcome Dr. Sarah Kelly as our speaker. Sarah is a postdoctoral researcher here at Dartmouth College in the Department of Anthropology, and I know her because she is developing and actually teaching right now a brand new class on the social lives of energy, which I am very, very excited about for our Dartmouth undergraduate students. We have a special feature today, which is a colleague and collaborator of Dr. Kelly's is going to give her a little bit more of an introduction. So I'm pleased to hand the mic over to Dr. Manuel Tironi from the Universidad Católica in Chile. So Dr. Tironi, over to you.
Thank you so much, Amanda, and the Irving Institute, and Sarah, of course, for having me here. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Kelly's presentation today. My name is Manuel Tironi, as Amanda said. I'm an associate professor at Universidad Católica here in Chile. And in the last 10 years, I've been doing research on energy conflicts, particularly around carbon contamination, and on the situated ways in which communities cope with and act upon systematic pollution. And I've been also doing a little bit of research on the ambiguities and tensions between renewable or green energy, both in terms of their operations and their discourses, and indigenous practices and cosmologies, and the emergence of what I've been calling ontological dissensus in territories that are subjected to sustainable energy extractivism. I've been working with Sarah in the context of CIHIDEN, which is the Center for Integrated Research on Disaster Risk Reduction, and more specifically within the Cultures of Disasters research line, which I lead, and where we are looking at ways in which disasters and risk are defined, imagined, and acted upon by diverse communities and in diverse territories. So really thinking through difference, alterity, and otherness to propose more just and integrated forms of disaster risk reduction in Chile and in the region. The work of Sarah within CIHIDEN has been really instrumental to think about the disaster energy nexus and to understand that disasters and the energy processes are related in a number of ways. In Chile, for example, a number of energy development and operating projects provoke or exacerbate disasters. In fact, one of the most noteworthy aspects of Chile's energy sector is the high level of social conflict. This is connected, of course, to Chile's neoliberal governance, and which I think Sarah will talk about a little bit today. Sarah is a young yet quite accomplished scholar. She has been publishing here. She has been publishing her work in energy research and social science, energy policy, environmental planning, among other journals. And she has a long-term and place-based commitment with Mapuche Huilliche people here in Chile, with whom she has been collaborating for several years now. And she has become a quite well-known figure here in Chile and elsewhere for her in-depth research on the hydropower sector and water at large, engaging with intercultural methodologies and indigenous legal orders. Let me just finish by this introduction by stressing the relevance of the Chilean case for thinking the connections between neoliberalism, energy, and community making, and also the importance of cultural studies of energy to render visible not only the conflict around the energy complex, but also the ontoepistemics, the short circuits around epistemologies and ontologies that are often at play in energy conflict processes and practices. With that said, Sarah, it's all yours.
Great. Well, thank you so much to Dr. Manuel Tordoni for taking the time to join us and provide that introduction, and for his mentorship while I've been working in Chile and at Dartmouth over the last few years. And thank you also to Amanda Graham, who I've had the pleasure to work with over the last few years at Irving, and I'm really enjoying working with as I teach this class, The Social Lives of Energy. Thanks also to the Irving Institute for organizing this, and to Stephanie Garcia for helping to organize this chat. So today I'm going to talk for 30 minutes, and I'm going to put my timer on right now. Hopefully I can keep to that, on institutional surprises in the water energy nexus, how markets and indigenous territorial conflicts shape the dynamics of small hydropower development in Chile. So for a short while, we'll briefly visit the Puelwi Mapu territory in this talk. This is Mapuche Huiche territory, and this is the Caucarupe River, which connects Lago Maiwe and Lago Ranco in the Andean Mountains. And today we're going to be talking about the small hydropower boom in renewable energy and how it's been materialized in Chile. But we're also going to be talking about the on-the-ground reality of this development and how it's being lived by different groups of people, in particular Mapuche people who have a different worldview. And so in this context, energy development can also be a colonizing force that affects how they're able to make decisions about their territory and how they relate to each other in territory. So that's a different context than perhaps other scholars might work in that are attending this. And I invite you to think about the alternative and different worlds present in this energy development mix that I'll be discussing. So a brief outline of my talk. I'm going to give a little bit of research context and history, particularly in relation to Chile's dependence on hydropower in its grid development, and also in relation to the neoliberal laboratory, quote unquote, that Chile is in relation to the Chilean dictatorship and how they installed neoliberal laws in the 1980s onward. Then I'm going to talk about my research, in particular the institutional surprises that I discovered in relation to small hydropower's development, particularly how it's both highly conflictive, as Dr. Tironi suggested a lot of energy development is in Chile, and also how it's performing in different ways in relation to market mechanisms than one would expect, and what that teaches us about both electricity and water markets. And I think that that's very relevant today as renewable energy around the world is being considered within market context. So Chile has a lot to teach us about other case studies I'd like to suggest to you all today. And then finally, we'll turn to questions and discussion. And I hope that you all can go sharing your questions as we continue, and I'll do my best to honor them at the end. So I'm an energy ethnographer. What that means is I study the daily life of energy. And as you all know, energy is, it transects multiple aspects of society. And so I both studied ethnography of Mapuche daily life and how they're impacted by hydropower, in particular small hydropower, which I'll be talking about today, but also how energy is developed across different sectors. So this is where my work has been published in recent years. And today I'm going to be talking about an article that I published in Environmental and Planning E with my colleague, Jose Miguel Valdez Negroni. And in general, my scholarship had tried to address this new phenomena of small hydropower over the last 10 to 15 years. What are its impacts? What are the concerns and questions related to small hydropower? So I'm a geographer by training, so we'll be looking at some maps throughout the course of this talk. To your left on the screen is a map of Mapuche territory in South America. Mapuche are the largest indigenous group in both Argentina and Chile. And to your right, you'll see a map of Chile, and that orangish brown area is Mapuche Huiche territory, which roughly overlaps with the Rios and Lagos regions of Chile. And it's called the Futawi Mapu, which is the Grand Territory of the South. Oh, let me go back to the screen. Okay, so broadly, my work speaks to the following question. What are the geographic and cultural implications of the clean energy transition? And as this graph shows in Chile, this is megawatts in construction from 2008 onward. Chile's experienced a drastic shift in renewable energy development. And as of 2018, over 57% of the projects in construction were renewable energy, or what Chile calls non-conventional renewable energy. And this includes biomass, geothermal, small hydropower projects generating 20 megawatts or less, tidal, solar, and wind. And so internationally, Chile has been considered a success story in terms of its rapid development of clean energy. But as a social science researcher, I am concerned with, as among other scholars, what are the other things that are being changed in this transition? Because we know that these are not just technical questions, but they're also social questions, they're economic questions, they're legal questions. And so in my research, I've been studying the other aspects that are shifting with the clean energy transition. So here's a quick look at Chile's grid. What you see to the left are the three main grids, but the primary one is in green, which is the central interconnected system, and that's where 99% of the electricity is being produced for, and it's for 98% of the population. And recently in 2017, the northern and central grids interconnected. So to your right, you can see what the breakup of that grid is. And hydropower at this point is about roughly over 25% of the installed grid capacity. I'll give you 1 second and then we'll move on. So renewable energy has primarily been solar and wind, as you can see to the left graph, again, 2009 to 2021, and this is energy in operation. So it's primarily been wind and solar, but small hydropower has continued to play a notable role in this grid composition. And it's been concentrated, the small hydropower development, in southern Chile. So while it's a smaller part of the grid transition overall, it's concentrated in the southern region where Mapuche territory is located. So it's a significant impact and transition for that local geography. So Máximo Pacheco, who was the Minister of Energy, called Chile's transition to renewable energy an energy revolution. And Chile has received, especially in 2016, 2017, a lot of, as this New York Times article indicates, a lot of international attention for being a quote unquote successful transition to renewable energy through markets, using an auction-based mechanism that prioritized and called for a certain quoted 20% to be met by these non-conventional renewable energy sources. And while this was regarded as a success, in practice, the outcomes have been more mixed. And while I'll be talking about, there were 97 small hydropower projects that came on from 2008 to 2018, there were hundreds of small hydropower projects that were stalled or in earlier phases of development and stopped. And there were large conflicts throughout Chile involving not only hydropower, but also wind and solar. So while on the outside, this was being regarded as a success story, in reality, on the ground throughout Chile, there were other impacts and issues involved that were not being captured. So as a researcher, I was interested in this. And as you can see, this is a graph of the electricity price. So Chile had the electricity price drop over time, and it was also seen as a success based on renewable energy being developed with a low electricity price. So just a little bit of history. I don't have a lot of time to go in depth into this, but as I mentioned earlier, the Chilean dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet was between 1973 and 1990. And so the Chicago Boys were a group of economists who were trained at the University of Chicago, and they're Chilean. And then they created this document called the Ladrillo, or the brick. And when the Pinochet government took power, they had this treatise and they passed it over and they said, implement this. And it was a neoliberal blueprint. And so what happened, and why Chile is such an important case study for water management, for electricity management, is that this institutional framework was put in place with little opposition because they were in a dictatorship. And so it was done in a much more orthodox way in relation to other countries and in an earlier period. So it's been this case study that scholars have looked to in terms of how water markets operate, et cetera. So in 1980, the Constitution was passed. In 1981, the Water Code was created, which created the terms for water to be managed through a market, and it privatized the use to water. So in effect, water is privatized. However, it is still in the Constitution a public good. And then it created the electricity law. And the electricity law led to the creation of 3 markets for generation, transmission, and consumption. And it created the terms for it because electricity is a natural monopoly. There's a lot more in-depth rules related to that. I should provide a caveat that I'm a water scholar who's gotten into energy research, so I'm happy to try and answer any technical questions. And if anything's over my head, I'll let you know. But that is the basis for Chile's electricity governance, and it's been an important framework that continues to be in practice today for small hydropower and renewable energy development. Earlier than the neoliberal process was put in place, Chile had a grid that was built around hydropower. And what that meant is, over history, that this electrical system has been vulnerable to water flows and water droughts in particular. So Endesa is the state electricity company, which was then privatized during the Pinochet regime. But it was created in 1944, and it was created with the idea of creating a central nerve or a grid that would run for the length of Chile, and it would connect all of the hydropower projects in the watersheds throughout Chile. So there is a history of blackouts that's also connected to water availability. And there's major blackouts documented in Chile from the 1950s onward in relation to droughts. So here's 2 other maps of Chile. In the 1940s, they proposed to create electrical regions for Chile and in relation to river water flow patterns. And to your right, you can see there's a map of Chile. For those who don't know much about Chile, it is a long, thin country, and the Andean Mountains are its eastern border and the Pacific Oceans is its western border. So it's a lot of short rivers that flow from the mountains to the sea with a high amount of availability of water for hydropower. So that's how the grid has grown in Chile. Now let's turn to small hydropower. The majority of small hydropower is done as run-of-river hydropower throughout the world. And this is a basic design of what a small hydropower project looks like. So instead of it being a reservoir-based hydropower where there is a dam and an artificial lake created, it diverts the water via that channel that you see to the left of your screen. So that channel diverts the water, and a smaller amount of volume with higher pressure generates electricity dropping via that penstock into the powerhouse. And then the water is returned downstream. So it's run of the river because the water is returned to the river downstream. Now, small hydropower around the world has been promoted as a more clean and sustainable alternative to large hydropower. However, that is based on little to no evidence. So what we've seen in Chile and other case studies, such as in British Columbia, Canada, in India, in Nepal, in Turkey, in places where they've developed a lot of small hydropower in the last 10 to 15 years, is that there are significant impacts, particularly significant cumulative impacts when there's multiple projects developed on the same river, particularly in a cascading design, as has become common in China. And so there are other questions related to small hydropower, but small hydropower is typically regulated in terms of megawatt. And so megawatt, I've argued in my research, it's not really the best fit for managing the impacts, because the impacts have much more to do with how the technical design interacts with the site in which it's located. So turning to my research, my driving research question when I first came to study small hydropower in Chile in 2014 was, how does small hydropower interact with indigenous rights claims? And I used a an assortment of methods to answer that question. I combined ethnographic research with institutional research, and institutions I was looking at, I'll show another slide in a minute, but how water, electricity, environmental, and indigenous rights, how those different laws are interacting in practice in relation to small hydropower and indigenous rights conflicts. So I use semi-structured interviews, document analysis, participant observation. I did transect walks with Mapuche leaders and participatory map making to better understand with them what were the impacts of small hydropower in their territory. And then to make sure that I followed our research protocol and represented findings correctly, we did collaborative analysis and writing to check those findings and make sure it was coherent with what we decided in our research process. So that was also it was led by a community-based participatory research methodology with the Alianza Territorial Pueblo-Mapu, which is an alliance of ancestral and juridical leaders in the Pueblo-Mapu territory. And I'm happy to talk more about that research in the question and answer section. So small hydropower involves environmental law, particularly the environmental impact assessment process. And a key issue with it in Chile is that projects generating under 3 megawatts do not have to enter the environmental impact assessment process. And projects generating 20 megawatts or less are often only required to do a lower declaration of environmental impact and not a full environmental impact assessment process. And what this means is that due to how indigenous rights are codified, that many times an indigenous consultation is not required for a small hydropower project. And that has created major conflicts and significant impacts related to a number of existing small hydropower projects in Chile, and it's increased the amount of conflict related to them. Also involved in small hydropower is the water law, particularly the water rights, which I'll get back to in a second. And then electricity law, in particular, the more recent commitment of the Chilean government to try and get to 70% of their grid being made up by renewable energy by 2050. So as I mentioned earlier, I'm a water energy nexus scholar researcher. And what I'd like to kind of return to today at the end of my talk is how the Chilean grid started out with a water energy nexus, and we can see water energy relationships are present in the grid's operation today. And the water energy nexus, as many of you well know, is a major area of policy and scholarship around the world. And often it's argued by water energy nexus scholars that further integration is necessary because water is needed for energy management, and energy and electricity is needed for all forms of water management, in particular distribution of water, etc. And so they need to be further integrated in their management for a more sustainable and equitable process. But what we find in Chile is that's not necessarily the case. And so I argue, along with other scholars, that we need to more critically study how water and energy are interacting to better plan for their equitable governance in the future, and that it's not necessarily the best solution to just call for more integration. So what I found in Chile, as I started to do more interviews with government officials, with people developing small hydropower projects in the private industry, as well as Mapuche people and other local agriculturalists and other actors, was that there were many projects stalled. While there were 97 projects that came online in that time period, there were hundreds of projects that were being stalled throughout Chile. This was confirmed by Ministry of Energy officials. This was confirmed by private sector actors. And I started to wonder, well, what's happening? And so that led my research process. So here's a graph of what's official. There are 97 projects that came on from 2000 to 2020, 2008 to 2020, and there are a much bigger number that are in earlier stages of the process that have entered the environmental impact assessment, that have acquired water rights, but they are not officially online. So the question was, well, what's happening here? There's many projects that are unfinished, and there's many projects in earlier phases, and people in territories know about those projects because they have earlier scoping conversations with project consultants developing the projects, or they learn about a neighbor who's had a developer come. And so there's a lot of rumors, and then there's a lot of projects that have applied for funding. And so there are paper trails indicating these projects. And so there's a paradox that's developed where a lot of companies are having trouble finishing their projects. They're having trouble gaining the permissions, gaining the water rights, getting the environmental impact assessment approval, and having a low enough level of conflict to be able to secure additional financing. I spoke with a few banks, and they shared that if they saw that there was environmental or social conflict involved with the project, that often dissuaded them from giving the next round of funding and allowing a project to complete. And as I did more interviews, I learned that it was becoming so difficult to get environmental approval due to the conflicts and the slow rate of permissions. It could take up to 7 or 8 years to get the permissions needed, that water rights were starting to be sold with approved environmental impact assessments. So a market emerged in Chile where people weren't able to finish their projects, but they were selling the approved environmental impact assessments for more value with the water rights. And this was because it was so difficult to get a project through. And so these institutional surprises associated with this development come with navigating the water and electricity sectors and navigating the different permissions. And as I indicate, this is a figure that we created for our paper in environmental planning. There's multiple places in the process of gaining permissions where the possibility of the project is not viable. And this has to do with how the water and electricity sectors relate and interact. So in this case, people typically start with the water rights, and the water rights actually determine where the project is going to be located. And then people next turn to try and get the electricity permissions and see about grid connection. So the water rights are determining where the projects are, and then they're looking at the grid connection. And that's a fundamental issue that's stopping a lot of projects from being viable, I found. Then later on, then they enter the environmental assessment process. And as conflicts arise, as other issues come up and they have to redo a study, they're also finding again that it's not viable. And then finally, when they look into if they're going to do a transmission line versus a distribution line, again, they can find the project is not viable. So this market-based framework where there's little state involvement is actually creating issues for the private sector as well. So one of the main issues is that there's a real disconnection between Santiago, the capital of Chile, and rural Chile, where most of these projects are being developed. In this map, this is one map of the research area where I worked, which is the Mapuche territory. We're looking north-south here, and this is Lago Maiwe and Lago Ranco. And those little red dots are all non-consumptive water rights. So non-consumptive water rights are water rights that are returned to the river. So they can either be a hydropower project or an aquaculture project typically. So all of those red dots are possible hydropower projects primarily. There's a couple aquaculture in the area, but those are primary, and those are based on the water market. So the water market idea behind it is that it's a free market with very little state involvement. So if there's a possibility to create a right, it has to be granted. So many of these rights to your right on the screen are higher up in the Andean Mountains, and they're not close to a high voltage transmission line because the central nerve of the Chilean grid is to your left, where it says, where you can see the yellow line, that's where the central grid is. So they're far away from the transmission, high voltage transmission lines, and they're close to a smaller distribution line. And so there's issues between the water rights being created and the electricity generation possibilities. And so one of the main issues that these private developers are making, most of them are working from Santiago, and they're finding and claiming these water rights through GIS systems. And then they go to visit their site and they find out that the change in relief doesn't work for creating the rights. So they have to refile and wait another 3 years for their water rights permissions to be granted. or they find out that the stream flow was estimated based on a nearby stream that has a lot more water availability, and there's not the water availability to generate. So there's a lot of issues based on the water market leading this process of hydropower development. And as I've been indicating, there's also significant problems connecting to the grid. And these are technical, but they're also legal, economic, and social. So again, returning to the Poway-Mapu territory, there's a distribution line, and the first 4 small hydropower projects that were created connected to the distribution line. And it was much more affordable, they tapped right in, and then the distribution line got maxed. And so no other small hydropower project was able to join the distribution line. So there was a proposal to create a high voltage transmission line. And that, of course, led to significant conflicts in the territory. And also the economics were difficult because of Chile's new transmission law. The way it worked is if the first owner created that line, by law, other generators were allowed to tap into that line. So there wasn't an economic incentive for the first person to create that line because they would have new generators joining their line, and then they would be at odds with the competition. So thus far in the Poway-Mapu territory, many projects that got approved environmental permissions that were supposed to go ahead have halted because a high voltage transmission line that was proposed in the environmental impact process had to desist due to a high level of conflict and difficulty securing additional funding. So what we saw across the sector is that there's difficulty gaining environmental permissions and additional financing for later stages in the process. And this is in large part, as I've talked about, in relation to the growing conflicts. So here for a minute, we'll step into the Mapuche cosmovision and how they view rivers. And what I've talked about in another article that I have, I've recently submitted to GeoForum, is that there's a water and a cultural dispossession occurring in relation to hydropower development. And so while small hydropower is generating less megawatts and it's believed to be less impactful, in this geographic and cultural context, small hydropower is very invasive and it's very harmful. And I want to be careful here and say that not all small hydropower is negative at all. And it really depends on a number of factors. In this case, Mapuche cultural geography and spiritual beliefs are connected to water. And so in areas where there are waterfalls, which are called Trayenco, or where there are water springs, which are called Minoko, those are areas that are targeted by small hydropower. Multiple Trayenco waterfalls have been affected by these small hydropower projects because, as you remember, when we saw that image earlier of what a run-of-river hydropower project looks like, it diverts the water above these waterfalls often and then returns the water downstream. But in Mapuche cosmovision, that is taking the Nawen, or the energy of the waterfall, and affecting how Mapuche people are able to communicate with their ancestors and communicate with these sites of spiritual and cultural significance. So this is one instance of showing how energy can be this colonizing force in its development if the regulation doesn't recognize the impacts in different geographies. And so the high level of conflict related to small hydropower is directly related to this. And to your right, that's a map that I created with collaborators during this research. And it's a map of the same territory that we've been seeing, the Poway-Mapu territory. And on the left of that is Lake Ronco and Lake Maiwe. But this map is oriented east-west in Mapuche geography as the water flows from the mountains to the sea and as the sun rises and sets. And again, I'm happy to talk more about this in questions to the extent that I possibly can answer them related to their cosmovision. But damming a river is really believed to harm their ability to reproduce themselves as a culture. So it's a very significant impact. And there have been issues related to how hydropower is being regulated in Mapuche territory due to this. So I'm coming up to my 30 minutes, so I'll stop here for now. But what I'd like to say is that, as I've shown in this talk, I've built on earlier scholarship, particularly my advisor, Carl Bauer, who talked a lot about how, and found in studying the water energy nexus in Chile, that electricity law actually dominates water law in conflict resolution. And once a river has a hydropower project installed, then electricity law actually manages how conflicts and how issues are managed on that river over water law. But we see in this case with small hydropower that while water rights are determining the project placement, the grid is actually a really key factor in determining project viability. So here we see how the water nexus is interacting in practice, and it's interacting in a way that wasn't expected in terms of planning for water and energy markets. So in terms of considering questions of energy justice and energy equitability, as well as effectiveness in developing renewable energy, understanding how these intersect in practice is really important for rethinking more adequate policy and planning for the future. So I'll stop there so that we can have a discussion. But I'd like to thank you all for staying with me. I look forward to questions and conversation. And there's my email if anybody would like to follow up with any other thoughts or comments in the future. Thanks so much.
Sarah, thank you very much. That was extremely instructive and a wonderful narration of the context and the challenges that you've been studying in terms of the intersection and interrelationship between water and energy in this really distinctive place. Thank you so much for your presentation. Not seeing any questions yet in the Q&A. That's a reminder to everyone who's listening. Please pose your questions. Put them in the Q&A. I think that Dr. Tironi and I will take moderator's prerogative and start us off with our Q&A. Dr. Tironi, do you have a question to kick us off?
Sure. Well, thank you so much, Sarah, for this provoking presentation. And I just wanted to ask you if you could elaborate a little bit more about your methods.
Sure.
It's quite interesting, that map that you showed about the small hydro projects, the location of those small hydro projects in the Mapu, and the spiritual control and the sites of the spiritual control significance. Mm-hmm. So I wonder how you are working through most conventional geographic methods such as mapping and cartographies, how you are dealing with interculturality, working through those methods. If you could speak a little bit more about your methods, basically.
Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for your question. So community-based participatory research was the guiding methodology. I came to Southern Chile being trained in that methodology. And so that led me to follow the ancestral order when I came to Mapuche territory and met with ancestral leaders before doing any research. And so I met with Lonco, who are spiritual political leader in the territory, two of them, as I started. And I said, you know, what are your questions? And I wasn't certain if we would find if I would be the right researcher to help them or collaborate, but we shared the same questions. We were interested in what was happening with small hydropower, how it was affecting Indigenous rights, what was happening with the transmission lines, because it was clear early on that the grid was important. And so from that point, I shared my methods, particularly the ethnographic methods, and applied methods with the Mapuche collaborators that I was working with. And so we started by doing more, they wanted mapping to be done. And that was because energy consultants working for the Ministry of Energy had arrived with maps starting in 2013. And so maps were introduced to these territories and people wanted to use them for their own interests. So it was convenient that I was a geographer because there was a desire to do mapping. So we did We did mapping with GIS systems using Chilean data available. And that map that I showed earlier on with the water rights, we mapped the water rights, approved hydropower projects or projects in assessment in the environmental impact assessment process, aquaculture projects, private conservation areas, and indigenous land titles, Merced land titles, to look at how dispossession have worked over time, in particular water dispossession. So we used that first level of mapping to what they called mapping threats, but to really look at how territory was seen from a Chilean institutional perspective. And then it organically came that this map we made with an artistic collaborator and someone who also provided technical support to the Alianza, as they were meeting with the Ministry of Energy, meeting with other government officials, and wanted to have a map that demonstrated how they knew their territory. So this map also came, each of those maps was worked through iterations before it was shared with outsiders, but this map came from a dialogue, and it really became an intercultural tool to facilitate communication and education with other actors. And we've used this map in presentations in Chile to different audiences, the Alianza and I, when presenting our work. And so I believe that maps are an incredible tool for education and outreach, and also for helping to move information between worlds, right? Between a Chilean institutional context, an international indigenous rights context, and a Mapuche context. So that's a little bit more about the methods. The transects we brought in later, and those were transect walks and floats down rivers to document aspects of hydropower impacts that might not have come up in other methods. So, for instance, observing issues with medicinal plants and how they're being affected was much easier to observe and document while walking through the territory than talking about in a room during an interview. So it produced relevant data for the research process.
Thank you for that, Sarah. And we are having some questions come in. There are several that focus on a similar theme. So let me read a couple of them out to you and sort of illustrate the theme that I'm seeing here. So one questioner asks for a little bit of information about whether and how the Mapuche people were included or given a say in small hydropower project approval. Were they involved at all? And then several questions are looking at, how do we remedy this situation, right? As we try to grapple with climate change, right, and are seeking to decarbonize our energy systems, right? If small hydro in these cases, is there any way to make small hydro in these cases acceptable, right, such that we can use this resource to decarbonize and help to meet our carbon reduction goals? How could we allay or address concerns of Indigenous peoples in this area, and by extrapolation in other areas, or is this a permanent roadblock? And how do we balance, right, these needs of Indigenous peoples and their heritage and the vitality of the location, the place-based cultural meanings, with our local and regional and global need to prepare for and address the challenges of climate change?
Those are really important questions. So first, in relation to our Mapuche people given a say in the approval. So as I talked about, part of that comes down to how small hydropower is regulated. So 3 megawatts or less, they don't have to enter the environmental impact assessment process. They just send a letter saying they're building a project. And then between 3 and 20 megawatts, it's considered lower impact. So it's kind of an argument that has to be made to make them do a full environmental impact assessment. And an indigenous consultation, which is regulated by Chilean law, that only occurs when there's a full environmental impact assessment. So many of these projects, and in general, the way the Chilean environmental impact assessment works is that many of the important aspects of a project are determined before there's any or very minimal local consultation has occurred. So for example, citing a project, determining important aspects like how many megawatts it will generate, how much water it will use. Those are all factors that are determined before consultation occurs. So that is one process that I believe really needs to be changed for these projects to come close to being more sustainable or working with local realities just in general. And I have a paper that just submitted for revision with colleagues in the Journal of Latin American Geography, where we look at the issues with Chile's codification of ILO Convention 169, which is an international indigenous rights treaty. And there's real issues with there's oversights and there's institutional kind of gray areas. And so what's happened in practice is that private companies are opening negotiations with select members of communities and creating these enduring fragments within communities and challenging ancestral authority. And they're doing it as it's convenient to them. So if a case is going poorly, they'll open negotiation later, or in other cases, they'll open negotiation earlier, and it's not transparent. So there's real issues with how consultation occurs and how it's being regulated that I think need to be addressed in the Chilean context and elsewhere. And then that broader question is such an important question, and it's not, I'll answer part of it. I'd say part of this is a question of sovereignty and self-determination, and the Mapuche have been fighting for many, many years to have self-determination in a more meaningful way. And so I think it's their decision, and it should be, in terms of what's happening with energy development in their territory. And there's certain houses, there's a high level of rural electrification, and then there's certain people who don't desire electrification. So that's a primary question that needs to be asked first, I think, in a site like that. And that's a question that's not that's their question to answer, right? And then in terms of small hydropower, I didn't have time to get into this in my talk extensively, but there's the central interconnected grid of Chile, and nearly, if not all of these small hydro projects are developing to join the central interconnected system. So that means they're operating an economy of scale and at a size that's financially viable for that market system. And so they're not that small, really, many of these projects. They're actually, some of them are significantly, are large and look like what we consider a large reservoir dam. And so I think that's a major question, is what is the grid and what are the technical and social arrangements around the hydropower project? And so an alternative example, further south in Chile, in the Pueblo River Basin, there's a real tradition of micro hydropower. And there, people are developing their own hydropower projects in rivers, and they know their river. They know where it floods. They know where it turns. They know the site where people use it to swim. They know where people go and forage this type of berry. And so they're better at siting these projects than someone coming from the outside who doesn't know the area. And they're developing at a scale that's meaningful for their local community to meet all the houses nearby without it being this massive amount going elsewhere. And I should say, I didn't go into this in depth either, is that the benefits of these hydropower projects are real short to medium term for a few people, like a tractor, a greenhouse. They're not typically, in any of the cases I've studied, including lowering electricity prices over the medium to long term. And they're not development projects that have a medium to long term view. So those arrangements also are going to impact how a community benefits and relates to that hydropower project. So I think these are a number of the factors, and I think that's a really important discussion that that we need to keep having.
Phrase, what I'm hearing you say is that the future of small and maybe small and micro hydro development in Chile, there is not zero potential for that, right? No. But the way in which it's being done at this time is full of is fraught, right, from a local community basis. And if the local community engagement can be engineered into the project at a much, it can be engineered into the contemplation of a project, right, from the get-go, that there are certainly examples where that development can figure out ways to work around the cultural issues. Is that an accurate characterization?
Yeah, that is a great characterization. Thanks, Amanda.
Okay, great. So another question for you, I'm sort of torn here. one questioner asks if you could expand on how you think future environmental policy should approach cultural impacts to reduce this type of conflict. And that really kind of, seeks to hone in on a thread, right, that we've been just discussing. So I
Yeah.
wonder if you might be able to comment briefly on that. And then there is a topic, a question on another topic that I'd like to make sure we can squeeze in before we wrap up today.
That is a huge question. I will do my best to give an answer right now, but I think those are the type of questions that are career or life questions. So it's one that I'm chewing on as well. I think that as a geographer, I think about different scales and I think about things in a very situated way. And so I think it's important to address and come to these questions from our local geographies and sites and think about more regional perspectives and regional planning than a whole nation state, and consider what are the regional trade-offs, what's being consumed at the regional level, what's being shared, and moving away from kind of working at larger scales that can kind of innately be less sustainable in terms of import, export, et cetera. So I try and kind of work from sites and collaborations and think about sustainable and intercultural and appropriate ways of working from there. So it's more of a, for me, it's more of a methodological approach than a set answer at this point. But I guess I'll leave it there for now, but I think it's a very important question.
Thank you. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Okay, so our last question for today, could you elaborate a little bit on whether you think there is a role for the state or public institutions in terms of ensuring meaningful consultation with Indigenous communities and entrenching sovereignty in approval processes? So keeping in mind previous neoliberal attitudes. So in other words, even given what you've just said, right, about the importance of if we can, devolving, control to local and regional actors, is there a role for the state?
Yeah. I think that given the role of the state kind of being an intermediary, I think it has to, in Chile at least, I'll speak for, the state is not meeting its agreements to international treaties in terms of ensuring an Indigenous consultation that assures free, prior, and informed consent. And so in Chile, they allow private companies to carry out the environmental impact assessment process not completely, but largely on their own prerogative. And that those interpretations work in the favor of private companies over Indigenous rights. So in that instance, I believe the Chilean state has an obligation to ensure a more ethical and complete, free, prior, and informed consent. And while that is, it's called FPIC, it is a imperfect tool, but it's one of the best tools and most recognized tools internationally, and it's what's already legally in place in Chile and elsewhere. So that is a really important role of the state to ensure that's being carried out properly.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Sarah, this has really been a wonderful hour that we've spent with you. So I hope all of our audience members can join me in applauding and appreciating the work that you have done and are doing, and the introduction that you've given us into this window, the window that you've given us into this context, and its relevance not just in the locality of Chile, but its relevance much more broadly than that as well. So thank you very much for participating in our New Energy series. We really appreciate it. And I think that now what we'd like to do is shift our screen sharing to be able to show a preview of coming events at the Irving Institute, just to make sure that folks who are on the call are aware that we're gearing up for a busy spring. And so let's see, on Thursday, we have the second in our series at the college of a program focus that we've called Crossroads overall, as a space for recognizing the interplay between race, energy, and the welfare of communities, in particular in the context of Los Angeles here in this year that is the anniversary of the Rodney King beatings a number of years ago. And so that event's happening Thursday at 1 o'clock. Next week, a week from yesterday, we have a Dartmouth Energy Collaborative seminar that is focused on renewable energy finance projects. This is as we lead up to our major conference in early May, which focuses on investing in our energy futures. And so this is a great way to bone up on some of that renewable energy project finance and development processes if you're interested in hearing from Josh Pearson, who has at EDF Renewables. And then 2 weeks from today, the next in our New Energy Series conversations will feature Michael Davidson from the University of California in San Diego, looking at carbon neutrality in China. So we hope you will join us for one or more of these sessions. And thanks again to Sarah and to Manuel, and cheers to all for a wonderful afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us. Bye-bye.